This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode of Roots and All, I'm joined by Clive Gravett, founder of the Budding Foundation and the Museum of Gardening. Clive is a passionate advocate for preserving gardening history, and he's here to share fascinating insights into the history of the lawnmower, an invention that revolutionised gardening as we know it. We also touch on the important work of the Budding Foundation in supporting education and young people through gardening.
I was brought up in my childhood on a farm up in Bedfordshire. I then wanted to join my father on the farm when I was 16, but there were lots of other jobs vacant at the time. And in those days at 16, you did what your mother said. And she said, you don't want to end up as a farm worker like we are in a tied house for the rest of your life. The bank is on the phone again offering you that job. And I did what my mother told me to do, and I spent 35 years in banking. In 2004, I could see the writing was on the wall for the big crash. So I resigned from banking and set up my own gardening business, which has always been the sort of love of my life. Did that for a few years, had my own nursery, sold plants online, did various sort of projects, garden maintenance and landscaping. Then in, I think around sort of 2003, I'd been doing a lot of work with schools, doing gardening clubs, etc., and helping schools get the children outside. I could see there were shortcomings in funding and people available to sort of help with this work, and I decided to set up a charity. But as I was heavily involved in collecting old lawnmowers as a hobby, I dedicated the charity to Edwin Beard Budding, who actually invented the lawnmower in 1830. And over the years since 2004 to 2016, I got the charity established. And also in 2016, we opened the Museum of Gardening in Hassocks, which is dedicated to Edwin Budding, with a vast collection of mowers and other gardening exhibits. And that's what I'm continuing to do today.
Brilliant. So Edwin Budding, am I right in thinking he was the inventor of the first lawnmower?
Yes, he was the inventor. He patented the lawnmower in 1830.
And what had been happening prior to that? I'm guessing there were lawns before that, but they were cut in a kind of manual fashion?
The lawn was invented, from my research, in about the year sort of 1200, 1260, when Albertus Magnus published De Vegetabilis, which was one of the first gardening books, and he virtually described how to lay a lawn with turfs, treading them down, watering them in, clearing the weeds, and we believe that was the creation of the first lawn. So we've got the first lawn in the 13th century, but up until Edwin Budding invented the mower at the beginning of the 19th century, grass was cut with scythes, and the chaps were known as mower men.
Right. And so that was using kind of manual labour. Did they ever employ machinery before that?
No, there's no evidence of machinery being used for cutting grass prior to 1830.
And then with the invention of the lawnmower, do you think lawns became then more popular because they were easier to manage?
Yes, I think they were, although in the early days of the lawnmower, it didn't really catch on. You know, for thousands of years, they've been using the scythe with no problems. So this big bit of heavy clanking machinery, very noisy, didn't catch on initially. And when Budding died in 1846, so we're talking about 16 years after the invention, only 1,000 or so lawnmowers have been sold. So it certainly wasn't an instant success. And he didn't see any of the benefits of it.
Oh, well, that's a shame. And I'm guessing, in as well as being clunky, they were also presumably expensive?
I would say so, yes, yeah. The original price would only be the very sort of large country houses that could afford a lawnmower. And perhaps that went on for some time, up until probably when we're getting into the sort of 1930s or so, perhaps. You know, it was the wealthy would have lawns and use lawnmowers.
Once that was invented and then became more commonplace, I'm assuming then there were other versions that went into production.
Yes, it gradually developed over the years. I've done a considerable amount of research, well, all the way through, really, the early years and later. Buddin died, as I said, in 1846, and a chap called Ferraby, who had funded his work, took over production. Also, Ransom's, the big lawnmower manufacturer that's still around today, they got a license to produce Buddin's mower in 1832. So they sold Buddin's type of mower right up until 1860, and then they actually designed their own machine. But prior to 1860, majority of lawnmowers were to the Buddin patent. But then from 1860 onwards, they became perhaps smaller, more efficient. There were more manufacturers. The horse mower was launched, I think, in about 1840, so it could cut wider expanses of grass and was obviously pulled by donkeys, ponies, or a horse. We do say that Shanks of Arbroath, Arthur Shanks, big lawnmower manufacturer and engineers, Alexander Shanks, they produced the first horse or pony mower in 1841. And we like to think that the reference to Shanks's pony referred to the lawnmower because you had a large lawnmower that was pulled by a pony, but the operator had to walk behind it. So it sort of fits that phrase very well. But other historians say that that phrase was around in the 1700s, but it's rather nice to link it with Shanks's pony.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I was just about to ask you that, actually, if it was linked. It does make perfect sense.
It's debatable, sort of in history, things do get written down and changed. And, even before the internet, I think things were quite misconstrued in sort of documents. It was sort of a hearsay rather than just definite facts.
Yeah, I got that impression actually because you've written a book about the history of the lawnmower. And when I was reading it, I think that you point out actually that there are a few anomalies in the record. So it was really interesting that you found that as you were doing your research.
Yes, so I find in a lot of avenues now, unfortunately, the internet is changing history. And when I give my sort of talks and lectures, I do sort of impress on people not to just Google a subject and believe what it says on the screen. There's a lot of misinformation. And the more people who actually share that misinformation, the more it becomes embedded in history. And the young people today won't know any different. So with my research now, I will only quote something as fact if it's come from a source document. So a lot of my research is from paperwork that the internet may lead me to where it is, but I inspect the actual written word before the internet sort of came into being.
You have clearly researched the topic brilliantly. And like you said, you've got the Museum of Gardening, which is a great resource for anyone who's kind of interested in that sort of thing. But going back to the Buddin lawnmower, I'm guessing that obviously there was the ponies and the donkeys and everything that got involved, and actually camels from the pictures in your book, which is quite impressive. But then his actual first machine, was that pushed manually? And how much did it resemble mechanically the kind of mowers that we know today?
Right, good question. It does really exactly resemble in its operation the mowers of today. So you have a rear roller, which obviously gives you the stripes on the lawn. The motion of the rear roller drives gears or a chain, which makes the cutting cylinder revolve to actually cut the grass. Now, the push mowers of today, I mean, they still use, and motor mowers, you'll see them used on sports grounds, you'll see them on Wimbledon football pitches. They are, again, they're driven. The main roller drives the cutting cylinder, and that was as Buddin's invention in 1830 was designed. Obviously, the makeup of them, the materials used has changed, but the principles of how the mower works is exactly the same.
I mean, they have evolved obviously over time, and there have been some offshoots like the Flymo, which you talk about in the book. So once you'd had the Buddin mower, which was pushed, then you had the horses. What came after that in terms of the evolution of the mower?
Well, in the late 1800s, steam was very sort of popular, and they even designed in 1895, 1896 steam-propelled mowers, which were rather big contraptions. They could also act as rollers. They could also drive other machinery, so they became sort of a multi-purpose steam engine that could also be used as a mower. But the first petrol engine mower, or petrol or paraffin, so a fuel-driven mower, came in 1896 and was invented by a chap called William Stephenson Peach, who was a great inventor and a master of engineering at Repton College and Malvern College. And he used to use his students of engineering to actually create many new bits of equipment, including petrol-driven mower and rollers.
And then after that, I'm guessing with the advent of electricity, was that what then took over? Or did it just run in parallel, really?
That sort of came in, but in fact, Stephenson Peach did actually design an electric roller mower, a massive sort of, 3 tons of solid metal with a wire attached to the top of it. And obviously in the late 1800s, not many people actually had electricity. But the main electric mowers came, Ransom's designed some for bowling greens, etc., in 1926. So electric mowers aren't really that new. They were around from the 1920s. And in fact, battery mowers, we think they're all the rage nowadays. ATCO was selling domestic battery mowers in the late 50s, early 60s, which in fact were powered by a big lead acid car battery rather than the sort of the small cells you get today.
And you've got some brilliant pictures in the book, and some of the ones that really stood out to me were the ones of the ride-on mowers, the first ride-on mowers. You would assume they were invented for a larger garden, but I think actually some of them might have made their way into domestic settings as well. Is that correct?
Yes, initially the larger mowers, they had sort of cutting widths up to sort of 42 inches wide, were sort of ride-on, for sports fields, large houses, etc. But then when we got into the 1920s, some of the rather heavy walk-behind petrol engine mowers, they did fit what they called a trailing seat behind. So even in the 1920s, you had what could be domestic ride-on mowers, and then they sort of gradually developed even more. A lot then became the sort of mini garden tractors that sort of had sort of multi-functions of doing various cultivating, including having a mower deck to cut the grass.
And then again, you follow the progression of the development into the robot and radio controlled mowers that are around today. When did they first come into production?
The robot mowers, we're probably talking about the sort of 1980s, 1990s. They were first used, but weren't that popular. And I often wonder whether they're that popular today. I mean, I do see them. In fact, I went to Norway last year and I was amazed in an area of sort of general sort of park grassland where people could have picnics, etc. I counted about 5 robot mowers that were all sort of sitting either under a bush or against a wall. And I assume at night they would all come out, controlled by sort of satellite navigation, and cut the grass. Can't imagine in this country that you could leave them all lying around, but it was quite fascinating to think of all these mowers would come out and deal with the grass at night. And some are now very, very sophisticated. They will come out and check the height of the grass, and if it doesn't need mowing, they'll go back and into their little hutch or whatever and plug themselves in. Others will only come out when it's dry. They don't want to get wet. They've now got, which has become a bit of a topic recently, they've got a hard collision avoidance system, so that if they come up against something like a cat sleeping on the lawn, they'll just give it I like to think, a gentle nudge rather than mowing over it. But that is a bit of an interesting subject because I've yet to read the article. Someone's just forwarded me an article from one of the hedgehog preservation groups saying obviously there's a massive decline in hedgehogs, but they seem to be blaming 30% of this on robotic mowers.
Wow.
Which I'm finding that quite hard to believe. Knowing a hedgehog, they get a slight nudge from something, they can run pretty fast. I can't quite imagine a mower, which is very close to the ground, going over the top of a hedgehog. So that's something when I get a spare moment, I'll be looking into it. But yeah, it does sound interesting.
And actually, you brought up an interesting point there, which is that you're not sure how popular these mowers are nowadays. I don't see them a lot in gardens. Do you have any idea of what is the most popular type of mower today that's sold, maybe in this country or even worldwide?
I would think probably some of the battery operated mowers, people are trying to move to them. As for sort of petrol engine ones, I mean, the haters are still around. Hater mowers, they started way back in the sort of 50s. They're still producing the sort of domestic rotary mowers. Honda mowers are quite popular and quite efficient. There's not so many sort of hand push mowers nowadays. Unfortunately, in the smaller gardens, the dreaded AstroTurf is taking over, which, whilst I use it for internal displays in the museum, I actually totally object to it being used anywhere else. It destroys wildlife and the planet, I think.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there, Clive. But yeah, actually also interesting that you mention there aren't so many of the old style around. But I'm guessing that people do have these antique varieties in use. And are there any that are particularly popular for people who like to do things in a slightly traditional way?
Well, yes. I mean, I do get asked by people, can I recommend an old hand mower? And usually it would be the Ransom's Ajax. It was one of the best-selling small push mowers of all time, from the 1930s right into the 1970s. It just sort of gradually modernised with parts of it being made from aluminium, but basically the same 12-inch six-bladed push mower. It was lighter than the very old mowers, but quite sort of manageable. Several people nowadays use them on allotments for cutting the small grass paths between the allotments, because on the allotments you don't really want to have a petrol mower, or you won't have electricity. So normally I would recommend the Ransom's Ajax if someone wants to get a bit of exercise and mow their lawn with one.
Well, from a sustainability point of view, they seem to make sense. And is there anybody today manufacturing those kind of manual mowers?
Yes, in fact, there's some manufactured under the Webb name, WEBB. Webbs were quite a famous mower producer from the late 1920s right through probably to the 70s. I have, in fact, met the guy fairly recently who took over the Webb registered name, and he is producing some sort of fairly lightweight Webb push mowers. So they are available. As I say, not that many people are buying them. They are on the market, yes.
So I guess to kind of wrap up, you mentioned the Museum of Gardening and also the Budding Foundation. Can you tell me a little bit more about those?
If we start with the Budding Foundation, it's a charity I founded in 2013, really to support young people in need, focusing on those who are sort of in some sort of desperate situation, whether it's housing, food, clothing. And we're linked up with other charities that are in touch with these families. So we supply grants to them. So we're in fact just a fundraising charity, because we're very small. There's me and a couple of other trustees. So we raise money for other people to actually plug the gaps for families living in deprivation. And the charity, our focal point, is the Museum of Gardening, which was opened in 2016 within the Tates of Sussex Garden Centre in Hassocks. And we're always expanding, not in size, but in the exhibits and the quality of the exhibits we have. And over recent years, we have accumulated some very unique items. I do like to talk about a plastic watering can, which most people would think is not that unusual. But we've got a futuristic watering can from 1957 that was designed by the top plastics engineer in the country and produced by Eco Plastics of Southend. The only other one of these that we can trace is in the V&A. I've done articles on it, I've spoken about it at talks, etc. So although it's just a plastic watering can, a futuristic one, it is exceedingly rare. And that applies to, several other of the perhaps older objects we display in the museum. They are one-offs in some circumstances and haven't been seen anywhere else.
I mean, it sounds like a brilliant place. And I saw you at the South of England show where you had a collection of some of the tools. And for anyone who's remotely interested in gardening, it's fascinating. Where would people find you, or where can they go to find out more?
Right, you can find out more. We've got a website for the charity and the museum. The charity is on www.foundation.co.uk, and the museum is just simply museumofgardening.co.uk. And there's full details there of our opening hours. We run a blog on some of our exhibits, and obviously up-to-date news about the charity.
Thank you very much to Clive for preserving this particular slice of gardening history, and thanks to you for listening. This is the last episode of 2024, so I'd like to thank you for lending me your ears and for supporting the podcast throughout the last year. Happy Christmas and lots of love and best wishes for the new year. See you in 2025. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.